Proposed rent stabilization law in Connecticut would ban all rent increases during a public health emergency like COVID or perhaps climate change. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over once again, rent control or rent stabilization laws, whatever they want to call it. I just call it rent control because rent stabilization is just terminology they try to use to try to soften it to make it sound like it's something different than what it really is, and it's not. Okay, it's the same old garbage that we know does not work. Now, this provision and these laws that they're trying to put in place, they have different things in them, such as banning rent increases during a public health emergency. And we all just went through a big public health emergency with the whole COVID-19 thing, but what other things could they possibly declare? Oh, well, you know what? The climate is bad, so therefore, we want to ban rent increases because it's affecting people's health. Or, they could say, well, there's winter flu season, so no rent increases during winter flu season. Who knows what they're going to do, okay? They open up the door to a lot of overzealous government regulation when they put these kind of provisions into the law. This is why I'm so opposed to it, okay? And the only thing it's going to do is make it almost impossible for landlords to run their business. And when they can't make a profit on their business, they get out of the business, which means there's going to be less housing for the tenants. There's going to be less housing overall. And the housing that's left, it's either going to be dilapidated in horrible shape or it's going to be unbelievably expensive, okay? So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. Do you think it's a good idea to have a rent increase ban whenever there's a public health emergency? Now think about that for a second. How many public health emergencies have we been through, okay? Now, obviously, we went through COVID just recently, right? But before that, there were other, like bird flu, swine flu, there's been scares over what could possibly happen with SARS and Ebola. That was other countries. But who would say that, hey, maybe the state will declare a public health emergency just so they could stop the rent increases? You notice that they don't say, well, we're going to limit the cost of food or the cost of fuel or the cost of the electric bill, or no, they only want to limit the cost of rent during these public health emergencies. You think that's a little odd? Well, that tells you where their priorities are at, because simply put, they think that we can take that sort of loss, and we can't. We're just like every other business. We have to operate on a profit, or the business is failing. And if the business fails and it goes under, then how is that going to be good for tenants? It's not. Gee, you know what? It just annoys me that they can't figure this sort of stuff out. But anyway, let's get into this article. This article is coming from NewJerseyNews12.com, and it says 12 at the Capitol. Tenants and landlords battle over proposed rent cap. And even though, it's coming out of a New Jersey paper, it's about Connecticut. But let's get into the article. Rents are skyrocketing, but should Connecticut pass a rent stabilization law? Hundreds of tenants and landlords are facing off Tuesday night before state lawmakers. Tenants need the protection of rent stabilization now, housing advocates said at a morning news conference. Statewide, rents are up 20% in the last 2 years, and more than 22,000 tenants were evicted last year, according to the Connecticut Fair Housing Center. So rents being up 20% in the last 2 years, right? If a rent is $1,000 a month, right? In 1 year, we'll just say we'll put it at rent increase 10% 1 year, rent increase 10% the year after. So it's up 20% total. So 1 year the rent went up $100. Next year it went up another $100. That's it. So it went up to from $1,000 a month up to $1,200 a month. And why were landlords increasing the rent? Was it to line their pockets? No, because we're going through the exact same problems with inflation as the tenants. You know what? Our fuel costs for, heater oil fuel is more expensive. Our labor costs, when we're paying that handyman, when we're paying that repairman to come by and fix your apartment, that is more expensive as well. The property taxes that the county or the state are charging us, they have gone up as well. They didn't go down, Believe me when I say they did not go down. On top of that, sometimes landlords have to refinance their properties, like big major apartment complexes, they only have limited amount of time before they are forced to refinance when they buy a property with a balloon. Okay, and so if you hit that 5 years, you might end up having to refinance at a higher interest rate, which happened to a lot of landlords, which means that, hey, our loan payments have gone up. On top of that, insurance costs have risen. You know what? I can go on and on about all the increased costs, but the point is that there are good reasons why landlords have to increase their costs. And unfortunately, we have to pass that on to the tenants. We're not going to take that loss. Simply put, we're running businesses. We want to make a profit. We have to pass that cost on. Just like when you go down to McDonald's, take a look at the price of the Big Mac. It ain't the same cost it was just 5 years ago. Believe me, I just was there. Okay, it is more expensive to buy a Big Mac now than it was just a few years ago. And that is reflective in all areas of the economy. Simply put, we're all suffering through the same inflation. And when you demand that landlords don't get to increase their costs in order to cover the increase in inflation, well, you know what you're doing? You're putting us out of business. We worked with one person. They were trying to increase his rent $1,500, said Paul Badrew with the Hamden Tenant Union. It was a 75% increase. I always hate stories like this. I'm going to stop, even though it was only one paragraph there, right? Because they're like, oh, they tried to increase the rent by $1,500 or something silly like that, right? So just imagine that you are staying in a 4 bedroom house with 3 baths and 3,000 square feet, right? And your rent in there, for some reason, the previous owner was letting you stay in there for $300 a month. Okay, just super duper cheap. And then, that person sells the house to a new owner, a new landlord, and the new landlord's like, hey, I can't even pay my mortgage at this $300 a month that this previous owner was charging you, right? So I'm going to bring it up to closer to market rate by increasing the rent by $1,500 a month. So now your rent is $1,800 a month, which is still a very reasonable amount, which is still cheaper than all of the other houses around there that are 4 bedrooms, 3 baths, and 3,000 square feet. And you're like, oh my God, this rent increase is too much. And I'm like, well, you know what? If I had to increase your rent to that amount in order to, make a profit or even to pay my bills, basically, I'm not here to subsidize your cheap living. And that's what these tenants want. They want you, as the landlord, to subsidize them living for as cheap as possible. As though you're like their social service provider, as though you're the government and you're obligated to be the housing authority and let them live for cheap. No, no, that's not the way this works. Not in a capitalist society. Okay, if you want that communist stuff, you can move out to Cuba, you can move on over to communist China, etc. And maybe they'll let you have that sort of deal. Rent caps are common in New York and big cities like Washington, D.C. Under a new bill in Connecticut, rent could not go up at all in the first year of a lease. After that, increases would be capped at 4% plus inflation. Tenants would also get at least 3 months' notice of any increase. So, yeah, you know what? They say in the first year, rent could not go up at all in the first year of a lease. Well, that doesn't even make any sense because most leases, right? They have it written into the contract that, hey, your rent is this amount for the first year. I mean, maybe, yeah, there are some people who do say, okay, well, for the first 3 months you'll be paying this lower introductory rate, and then you're going to jump up to a higher rate, right? And that's a way to get people to be able to move into units, right? That's not saying that, oh well, we're trying to cheat the tenant. The tenant agrees to that in the contract that they sign. So you're going to take that away from the landlords, and the landlord's just going to say, okay, well, I'm not going to have any lower introductory rates. You're just going to pay the higher rent. So how does that benefit the tenant? It doesn't, right? But then they say, oh, well, landlords are limited to 4% plus inflation. And the question then becomes, well, who decides what inflation is? Now, This is a big problem up in New York, right? Where they say, okay, they have this rent control board or whatever that decides how much they think inflation is, and it's nowhere near what actual inflation is. It's what they believe is a fair rent increase for the tenants. Now, if they actually went on what actual inflation was, the rent increase would be much, much larger. But then we get, politics and bureaucrats involved in it, and we get this sort of nonsense where landlords aren't able to raise their rents to a reasonable level to be able to cover the expenses that they're incurring. And all we end up with is a whole bunch of dilapidated, obsolete properties with a lot of repairs that are needed. So I am against rent control. I don't want anyone to ever doubt that for 1 second. I think that no matter what rules they put into it to try to make it a little bit different, oh, it didn't work over there because they didn't do it like we're going to do it. That's what these people always say, right? No matter where you implement these government price controls, they do not work, and that is the main point that I'm trying to make right now.